Hello.
Okay, I believe we're going live now. Okay, so we're here in the Zoom room with a nice intimate crowd, and then we're going to be broadcasting now to Aish, UK. Okay, I believe we're going live. Oh, that's me. All right, fine. All right, welcome everybody. We're going to be discussing price gouging today, and I have to admit, this really took me on a journey. I thought that there was one direction to move in terms of Jewish law, and I was completely taken by surprise. So there's going to be some very interesting, enlightening new ideas, both for me and hopefully for the rest of you. Nescafe is not giving Aish or FJL any money by my putting product placement into this class. Okay, so hopefully we'll have at least a couple more people joining in on the Zoom so that we can have a nice discussion. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is we're going to start. We're going to start now. I'm going to share my screen and I'll put up some of the sources now. For those of you who were here last time, you know the basic structure. For those who are joining for the first time, the idea is as follows. We're going to be discussing some classic Jewish sources on this subject. So there is actually quite a lot that has been said. And so we're going to grapple with each of the sources and kind of have a bit of a discussion in terms of what it means for our applying the situation to today. So just to speak it out a little bit, today's subject is going to be the question of price gouging. In other words, during times of disaster or crisis, similar to times like these, where either commodities become scarce or there is a new demand for some new commodity that wasn't previously there. And for those of you who are economically oriented, the demand far exceeds the supply. And all of a sudden, what you have is two choices. Either you sell out of everything very quickly because the demand is so high, or you raise the prices so much that there is still enough demand to meet the supply, but you're able to charge a fortune. So for those of you who within the last few weeks have been attempting to purchase hand sanitizer, I'm sure what some of you are familiar with this concept, that you go into the pharmacy and either they have a sign on the door that says, sorry, we don't have any hand sanitizer, or you walk in and they say, yes, that'll be 15 pounds for a small bottle of hand sanitizer. So the question is, are you allowed to do that? Is that a permissible thing? So, so right now, I'm joined just by Austin and Aaron here. So I'll ask either of you guys if you have any strong thoughts or feelings on this from an ethical point of view. We all know that more or less within common law, it is relatively legal to do such a thing. Although Austin, our resident barrister, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly there haven't been anybody coming around checking on the chemists to see how much they're charging for hand sanitizer. So, but does anyone have any kind of ethical quandaries about this? Either whether it's a strong opinion or maybe you're just thinking out loud.
Are we talking about this purely at point of sale? Can you hear me? I'm not sure if my microphone's covered.
Now I can hear you perfectly, yeah.
Okay, are we talking about this at point of sale where it's just the retailer who's marking up the price considerably, or are they passing on to the buyer a markup caused by increased cost in supply chain? So
okay, so first of all, Austin, we had you loud for like 5 seconds, and then you
1 second. Is that any better?
It's a little bit better. So you're asking, are we talking about retail or wholesale here? And I would ask you,
does it matter?
Yeah, what does it matter? Because either the retailer is ripping off the customer, or the wholesaler is ripping off the retailer, and then if the retailer has to go and sell it at that, you're saying that retailers are in a better position to say that again?
To oppose these practices. And retailers are in a more powerful bargaining position vis-a-vis wholesalers than consumers are vis-a-vis retailers.
You're saying that retailers maybe have more control. They can refuse to purchase from the wholesaler, and maybe the retailers, because there's fewer of them, they could perhaps bind together and collectively refuse to purchase from the wholesaler at that price. So you'd say that maybe that would give the retailers maybe more of an ethical responsibility to oppose the price gouging rather than any individual customer who has very, very little power in the market.
I'm not sure I'm going there with the question. Maybe. I don't really have a strong view on this, but I think sort of shooting very much from the hip here, it would be, because retailers have that power that customers don't, it would almost seem more unethical for the retailers to price gouge than for the wholesalers to price gouge. Because if the wholesalers are price gouging, they're doing it to customers who can fight back. Whereas if the retailers are price gouging, the customers can't. So it almost feels, if we're going to say it's unethical, which is, again, a very large if we're going to say that, then it would seem more unethical for the retailer to do it.
Okay. So that's an interesting distinction, and let's keep that in mind because I hadn't thought of that before, but it is a very interesting distinction. In any case, I want to just kind of lay out the issue. I mean, on the one hand, we largely operate by a fairly free market, and we will see that in the Torah as well, there does not appear to be that much interference in terms of the market. Now, we'll see maybe some caveats to that in a little bit. But it would appear that if, for example, there happened to be some sort of opportunism whereby you happen to own a particular commodity that happens to get becoming very in demand right now. So nobody would necessarily fault you for trying to capitalize on that. All of a sudden you had, a year ago, you happened to be sitting on 1,000 fidget spinners when all of a sudden the fidget spinner craze got huge. Everyone remember that? And who's going to tell you that you can't charge £8 for a fidget spinner when you bought them each for 30 pence? Now, on the other hand, it could get hairy where we start talking about, if you could imagine a case of a natural disaster where, let's say, there was some sort of drought. And now all of a sudden, in order for people to drink water, you're charging people £10 for a bottle of Evian. So now all of a sudden that becomes a much more distinctly ethically hairy situation where we say, I don't know, that remains to be seen whether that's something that would be acceptable or not. On the one hand, you would say that if I were to charge only £1 for a bottle of water in a time of droughts, then I would sell out immediately. And maybe that's not making things any better. But on the other hand, you might say that if I'm now charging £10 for a bottle of water when everybody needs water, maybe I'm now discriminating against the people who cannot afford that much water. And then there's some sort of real discrimination going on here. So now that we've kind of set up the question, let's share the screen, and I will present to you a few of the sources that the Torah has to say on it. So I'll be honest with you, the first place that I went to look at instinctually was a halacha, a Jewish law called Ona'at Mammon, okay, which is basically exploitation. So we are familiar with the injunction not to steal. Some of you may also be familiar with the injunction that you're not allowed to use unfair weights and measures. So back when people were using specific weights in order to measure out how much flour that they were giving you. Let's say they had a 1 kilogram weight, but really in reality, it was actually less than that. And then you put, your 1 kilogram weight, which is really 0.9 on one side of the scale, and then you'd weigh out your flour on the other side of the scale. So then all of a sudden you're giving people less flour than they paid for, and that's ripping people off. So those are some very clear examples of theft. However, there's a distinct halacha, a distinct Jewish law that prohibits against something called price exploitation, whereby you overcharge for a good, and unbeknownst to the purchaser, that's not the market rate. So I want to show you the source inside, and we'll take a look at what the exact prohibition is. It says in Vayikra, which is in Leviticus 25:14-17, when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not exploit, one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. Okay, let's just back up here. The way that land purchase took place in biblical Israel was that every family had a plot of land that was theirs forever. Now, you could sell land to other people if you were in dire straits, and it really was the last resort, because if you could imagine, the society was set up such that that basically was where you got your income from. It was not a largely commerce-based society. It was a much more agrarian society. So your land was your income. But if for any reason somebody could or had to sell their land, they could. However, every 50 years, there is what's known as the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year, in addition to being a kind of ultimate sabbatical where people would leave the crops to lie fallow, just like every 7th year, the sabbatical Shemitah year, in the 50th year, many things would happen. All Jewish servants would be let free. And in addition, all ownership of land would return to their original owners. So when you were selling your field, what you were really doing was selling your field for the number of years before the next Jubilee year. So if the last Jubilee year was 25 years ago, you're only selling 25 years worth of land. And what they're saying is you have to take into account how many years are left in the Jubilee year. And when you sell to somebody, you can't overcharge them based on how many years are left. Continues the verse, the more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price you pay. For what he is selling you is a number of harvests. Do not exploit one another, but fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. Okay, I the Lord am your God. So if we take a look at how Maimonides codifies this, welcome Daniel. We've begun to look inside the verses. The first source here just telling you a blanket statement that one should not exploit your fellow when it comes to monetary dealings, and therefore you have to accurately assess and appraise the land or whatever commodity that you're trying to sell. And similarly, we'll see that it was that people can underpay as well. That would also be a prohibition of onat mamon. Says Maimonides here, how much unfair gain must there be in a transaction for the one who profits to be required to return it? An even sixth. Okay, so there are certain laws in the Torah that were given to the sages to interpret exactly what the measurement should be. So if the Torah says, well, you can't rip people off. So it doesn't specify exactly how much. So the sages introduced the measurement of a sixth. If something is worth 6 pounds and I charge you 7, that officially is the prohibition of overcharging somebody. Okay. Now, however, if it's costs £9 and I charge you 10, there's a dispute as to whether that's considered part of the prohibition. As we'll see, there are different laws for how much you overcharge somebody. If you overcharge exactly a sixth, as Maimonides says, if the unfair gain was even the slightest amount less than that, e.g. the person sold an article worth 60 dinarum for 50 and a pruta, he is not required to return anything. So if perhaps, let's say, the person purchasing this article underpaid, but only underpaid by a little bit less than a sixth, you're not required to return anything, for it is common for people to waive any loss less than 1/6 of the article's value. So you are allowed to overcharge up to 1/6 or underpay, although there are some who say that even that counts under the prohibition of onat devarim, onat mamon. However, you wouldn't be required to return anything. However, if you overcharge a sixth, then you'd have to return the money that you overcharged. And if you overcharge more than a sixth, then if the customer wants to, they can nullify the sale altogether. Now, which case are we talking about? What's interesting here is that this sounds to be, on first glance, a blanket statement for overcharging in general. You're never allowed to overcharge more than the market. Now, if we were to stop here, I would ask you, does that strike anybody as troublesome? Does that bother anybody? If I say to you, you're never allowed to overcharge, you're never allowed to underpay. Can anyone think of an example where you would readily agree that it's perfectly permissible to overcharge or underpay?
I would imagine that when you're selling services, it's very tricky to even say what a sixth would be, because you would need to have some sort of objective value to what you're selling.
Okay, great. So let's begin by defining our terms. Of course, what we're speaking about here is something that readily has a set price or an agreed upon price. Let's say some sort of commodity that's very accessible and that's relatively equal throughout the market. In that case, it's very easy to know whether you're undercharged or overcharged. In the case of a service, so first of all, it's very difficult to compare to other people because you could theoretically be charging much more because you feel that you have a much higher quality service to give. So that's a good example where we would say that the law of ona'at mamon would not apply if you're saying, well, look, I'm the best, I give the best back massages in all of town. And if you don't like my prices, then you can go to somebody who gives a worse back massage. I wouldn't consider that that's called overcharging, right? Unless you really are. I don't know, maybe there are some services that can be quantified. I'm thinking maybe for an MOT. Let's say you're going to have your car serviced every year and it's the same type of servicing and you can go to any garage to do it. Maybe in that case, one could say that there's something to be said for an objective value. I was thinking more in terms of the case of investments, right? Just imagine that you're buying and selling stocks or any type of thing that could be traded. I mean, the whole market works based on overcharging and undercharging, based on what you perceive the value to be now or in the future. So it's very difficult to say that there's a blanket prohibition against overcharging or undercharging. We have to be a lot more clear with this. So I'm going to show you now another part of the Talmud where it adds a new caveat to this case. In the case of a seller who said to the buyer, concerning this item that I am selling to you for 200 dinars, I know about it that it is worth only 100 dinars, and I am selling it on the condition that you have no claim of exploitation against me. In that case, the buyer has no claim of exploitation against him. And likewise, in the case of a buyer who said to the seller concerning the sighting that I'm buying from you for 100 dinars, I know about it that it is worth 200 dinars, and I'm buying it on condition that you have no claim of exploitation against me. The seller has no claim of exploitation against him. The Talmud Bavli here seems to be explicitly saying that the only time where the prohibition applies is where you are unknowingly ripping off. In other words, the buyer is unknowingly being ripped off. They don't know that down the street they could go and buy the same commodity, exactly the same thing, for a fraction of the price. However, if both parties know that this is not worth, this is either an overinflated price or the buyer is buying it for a vastly reduced price, then as long as they both understand and know that, then there's no prohibition whatsoever. So the real prohibition of exploitation, of exploiting somebody in business, is in a case where you're ripping them off, where they don't know. And what's fascinating is that if you read over there in the Talmud in Bava Metzia, more of the laws that are pertaining to this, there's a time limit as to when the person who is ripped off can renege. And the time limit essentially is how much time it takes for them to go check with another store or with somebody who's more in the know. If you had enough time to check and to say, oh, look, I've just compared prices and I see that I really did get ripped off, immediately you have to come back and renege on the sale. If you wait too long, then we consider it as if you had implicitly agreed to being off. So we see that if two people agree that one of them is getting ripped off, then it's totally fine. I'll give you a relevant example, which is something that some of you may find issue with, and yet this is something that Jewish people have to hold themselves to a higher standard. If you're at a garage sale, your neighbor's garage sale, and you see a painting there, and you know that that painting could potentially be worth a lot of money, and for them, they think it's junk, you very well may have to inform them. You can say, hey, by the way, this painting might actually be worth a ton of money. Now, on the one hand, they could say, yeah, that's okay. I don't know. I don't have time to get it appraised. I'm selling it for £5. Or alternatively, they could say, okay, fine. So I'm going to hold on to it. But in any case, you can't unknowingly rip somebody off. That's the law over there. So now, just for those who are involved in the discussion here, is there anybody who has issue with this, who has a problem with this? Anybody who says like, no, you've gone too far. This is way too drastic of a situation. Anybody who's on who's watching now on YouTube can also weigh in. But what do you guys think? I'll take the silence as no strong objections. Austin?
Not really an objection, but maybe I'm looking at that source a little bit differently about the you have no claim against me for exploitation. Am I still inaudible?
You get loud for like a couple seconds, and then you get
I think my microphone might be up here, and I'm looking in the wrong direction. That could be it. Anyway, it seems to me there that it's not saying this prohibition only applies where there's a lack of knowledge. It seems more to be saying that the remedy for breach of this prohibition can be waived through mutual agreement. So what we haven't discussed, because it seems like a pretty illogical case, so it would probably not come up, is where the buyer knows that he's being overcharged and the seller doesn't know that he is overcharging. And in such a case, if a buyer buys knowing that they're being overcharged, doesn't say, I know I'm being overcharged and I'm paying more than I should, but the seller doesn't know and they don't have this agreement not to have a remedy for overcharging, then can the buyer, who knew he was being overcharged when he bought the goods, can he then come back a few minutes later and say, actually, you were overcharging me, I want to undo this sale?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, Austin, you're getting into kind of the theory of this law, and you're asking, is it something that has to be waived explicitly through consent, or in a case where a seller unknowingly undercharges, the seller doesn't realize that he or she is undercharging, but the buyer does realize that they're being ripped off. Can that buyer come back in 10 minutes and say, look, I know I was being ripped off, but nonetheless, I still want to renege on the sale anyway? Excellent question. I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure. It's a great question. I'll have to take that to somebody who's studied the monetary laws a lot more than myself. What we do know, however, is that when both parties are perfectly aware that there is an overcharging or an undercharging going on, then we don't see that we have that prohibition anymore. I want to show you now. I'm going to share my screen again. I want to show you now another source whereby it's the Book of Mitzvahs, which was a book written in the Middle Ages, around the 13th century. Actually, was purportedly written. This rabbi wrote it for his son's bar mitzvah, where he goes through every single one of the 613 commandments, speaks a little bit about what the parameters of the mitzvah are, and then talks a little bit about what are the maybe one way of approaching the reason behind the mitzvah. So the Sefer HaChinuch here on this mitzvah of Ona'at Mamon says, the root of the commandment is well known, as it is something to which the intellect testifies. And if it had not been written, it would be appropriate that it should be written, as it is not fitting to take the money of people through falsehood and deceit. Rather, everyone should earn that which God has granted him through his toil in truth and righteousness. You should do things honestly. You shouldn't trick people out of their money. And there is a benefit to each and every one with this thing, such that just like he will not mistreat others, others will also not mistreat him. It's fascinating. He's saying, well, it should be obvious, but let me just speak it out. What's the benefit of living in a society where people aren't trying to trick you all the time? The answer is that you don't have to live in a society where you have to be worried about people tricking you all the time. And even if there be one who knows how to trick more than other people do, let's say that you happen to be blessed with a very cunning mind and you know how to swindle everybody. However, maybe his children will not be so and people will deceive them. I don't know. Maybe one day either you or your family will get taken for a ride. And so it comes out that the things are the same for all, and that it is of great benefit for the inhabitation of the world. And God, blessed be he, created it to be inhabited. So we all have to live together. We all have to make sense of our lives together. And people don't want to live in a world where they're constantly living with mistrust. Now, I would say, by the way, anybody who wants to, feel free to chime in here. But I would certainly say that although in our case of charging too much for hand sanitizer, it appears to be that everybody has working knowledge that 15 pounds for a small bottle of hand sanitizer is charging too much, and therefore it would not technically fall under the category of exploitation as outlined in this mitzvah. However, one might say that based on the underlying reasons behind this mitzvah, where people don't want to be tricked, people don't want to be deceived, it's possible to apply this even in our case. Today, maybe you're the retailer and you've got the commodity that everybody wants, and so you can make an easy buck off of other people. Maybe tomorrow you're going to be the one who's in need. You're going to be the one who doesn't have the commodity, and now somebody else is charging you a fortune. I think there's a similar understanding here that you wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of having to wait in a queue for a vastly overpriced commodity just because you can. That's just a reflection of mine. It seems to be a certain refinement of sensitivity, not something that is necessarily the letter of the law, but maybe would be the spirit of the law. Now, as I progressed, I found other sources, however, that speak much more specifically to the point of whether or not we should be careful about people price gouging for commodities. So now I'm going to take you to some sources that seem to be much more hitting the nail on the head. And this is what I found after more digging, after realizing that in a certain sense, we weren't going to find a definite answer from the mitzvah of exploitation of ona'at devarim. However, we can find in the Talmud certain cases where there were questions of people price gouging. Let me take you to that right now. This is a Talmud market inspectors to supervise the accuracy of measures. They would have people who would go through the marketplaces and test everyone's weights and measures. The Gemara infers, but the court does not appoint market inspectors for supervising market prices. It only spoke about accuracy of measures. Real theft. What about overcharging? The Gemara relates. The house of the Nasi, that's the prince, the kind of the local monarch, the local aristocrat, appointed market inspectors for supervising both measures and prices. But Shmuel said to his student, the sage Karna, go out and teach them that one appoints market inspectors for supervising measures, but one does not appoint market inspectors for prices. So Shmuel, who was one of the great rabbis of the Talmud, said, we do not regulate prices in the marketplace. We do not. However, Karna went out and taught them that one appoints market inspectors for supervising both measures and prices. Karna disobeys his teacher's teaching and goes out and tells them to indeed appoint inspectors for prices. Shmuel, hearing what he had done, said to him, what is your name? He replied, Karna. Shmuel said, let a horn, which the name Karna means horn, emerge in his eye. A horn, i.e. a growth of flesh, emerged in his eye. That is a careful warning to all of you out there that you better listen to your rabbis. The Gemara asks, and Karna, in accordance with whose opinion did he hold, which led him to disregard his teacher's statement? Because Karna surely was not acting unilaterally. He must have held of the opinion of a different sage, and indeed he did. He held in accordance with that which Rami Bar Chama says, that Rabbi Yitzchak says, one appoints market inspectors for supervising both measures and prices due to swindlers, Ramayim, people who are tricky and deceitful. So what we see here is a dispute in the Talmud between Shmuel and the opinion of Rami Bar Chama in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. And even though Karna appears to have acted in the name of Rabbi Bar Chama and Rabbi Yitzchak, nonetheless, one may not do that when given an explicit injunction from his or her teacher, from his or her rabbi. It's perfectly acceptable that you're allowed to disagree with other people, but not when your teacher tells you an explicit ruling. Nonetheless, we see that there appears to be a dispute here. Should we appoint officers to regulate market prices? Now, the interesting thing is that if we go to the codification of law, the Talmud is merely a discussion. The Talmud often will not tell us what the final ruling is, make us opinions. But if we do, in fact, go to the codification of the law, I'm going to show you now a section from the Arba Turim, the Tur, who was the kind of the precursor to the Shulchan Aruch, a very, very influential halachic legal source. The Tur says the Jewish court is obligated to appoint market inspectors so that each person cannot profit as much as he wants, only up to a sixth. So the Tur here clearly referring to the fact that not only are the market inspectors ensuring that market prices are fair, but they're also taking a page out of the Ona'at Mammon playbook. They say that the only thing that's fair is that people can charge up to 1/6 more. But after that, the Jewish court has to regulate market prices. So he's clearly siding not like Shmuel, he's siding like the other opinion. However, he adds a caveat. In which case does this apply? In commodities that are essential to life, such as wines, oils, and flowers, but in other goods they should not set prices, and people can profit from them as much as they want. Then he adds, as an example, one may not sell eggs for double the going rate, but up to double they can charge because they are not absolutely essential for living. So the Torah makes it very clear that there is a distinction to be made, which I think is a very fair one, in matters of essential living, where everybody needs these commodities. Then even knowingly overcharging people is an unethical thing to do. And the court has the right to step in and prevent people from doing that, because then all of a sudden you're going to start finding people who cannot afford basic necessities who are going to have to go without. But if you decide that you want to charge 4 times the price for smoked salmon, I mean, look, don't ask me. I think smoked salmon is a basic life essential. But something like caviar or a very fine cut of meat, and you want to overcharge for that, then gesundheit, go ahead. There's nothing ethically improper about that. I think that is a very fitting distinction to be made. And so it appears in this case that there's some type of middle ground. The Torah does not go as far as saying that somebody who wants to overcharge for a basic necessity is doing the wrong thing. And yet the Torah is, the Talmud is now telling us, however, that we are certainly permitted to adjust the market prices based on some sort of imposition of regulation in order to make things more just. And so somewhere in the middle where we have to decide, so let's say you're a retailer, are you permitted to sell hand sanitizer or some other basic necessity at a very inflated price until some governmental force comes and tells you not to? Or do you think that you should have to take the initiative and say, look, I personally am not going to overcharge people? Any thoughts?
I think if you're the retailer, you're also at the end of the supply chain. So you might have in turn have been ripped off. And in that case, you would want to be at that end, because if you're allowed up to a sixth in profit, you would actually get a larger amount by being at the end of an overinflated chain.
Yeah, excellent. So interestingly, Daniel, Austin raised this before you came in, that there might actually be a difference between the wholesaler and the retailer. And while it's certainly true that, so I would ask you, Daniel, do you think that what would you say? Is there more of an ethical responsibility on the retailer, on the wholesaler, before you get to the customer? What do you say?
I would say in the case, for example, of the hand sanitizer, it's the case of the manufacturer who would set the initial chain of events rolling. Something that I thought quite interesting as an idea from the retailer side of things is they could almost argue by superinflating prices of something where people might be panic buying, that they're doing a service to society to dissuade people from overbuying something that they don't need.
Okay, excellent. So I think that's a really brilliant insight, in the sense that we tried to come up with a case whereby it could be that overcharging for something may actually recorrect the market, right? If something is too inexpensive to purchase, and I think that this is something that, I don't want to get controversial or political here, but this is something that people talk about with regards to I can't remember what they're called, pollution shares, something like that, whereby you can purchase amounts of pollution that you're allowed to put into the atmosphere, and in exchange for that, you're allowed to create that. So what that essentially is doing is saying that there's a hidden cost to what you're doing. The market rate is actually too cheap. It's actually below what what the price should actually be. And by charging more, you can actually readjust the market. It may be similar in the case that you're speaking about, Daniel, whereby people who are purchasing too much may be corrected by an overcharging. Now, the problem is that even though you're right, people who are buying too much may be dissuaded from buying more in a panic buy if the price were raised. However, what you're doing is you're essentially locking out people who can't afford it. If you raise the price too much, then as much as you want to, keep the shelves stocked, you're going to prevent people altogether from being able to buy for those who cannot afford. So there is a bit of a trade-off here. I don't think it's black and white, but it's certainly a point well taken that you can find examples where not every single time that somebody's overcharging is necessarily 100% evil.
I think, yeah, just to jump in on that, again, moving away from the hand sanitizer question of right now with coronavirus, if we took it into regular life, governments do this all the time. For example, with the amount of taxes that they add in on cigarettes or fuel for cars, they're already super inflating certain prices in order to try and drive behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's very much a point well taken, which is that they're trying to internalize an externalized cost. There is an external cost to fuel consumption and to cigarette smoke because, for example, people who smoke cost the NHS a certain amount of money. And you might want to say, okay, if it's a what's the word? A patronizing government? No. There's a certain word that I'm looking for where the government is taking your well-being into account and not just minimizing harm, but also trying to maximize people's good. The word escapes me. If anybody remembers it, please.
I don't know. Nanny state is
a nanny state is a good word.
Maybe.
Yeah, a nanny state is a good word for it. Okay, so I want to show you one more source, and then I'll tell you one more source that I found too late to add onto the source sheet. There was, now with regards to Jewish law, okay? This is a fascinating example, and there are actually a couple examples of this in the Talmud. Shmuel said, now by the way, this is the same Shmuel who said that we shouldn't regulate market prices. Shmuel said to those who were selling pristine myrtle branches, okay? So the time was Sukkot, it was fall. And of course, all the Jews were out buying the 4 species that go into making a lulav and etrog, right? So you have the lulav, which is the willow tree. You have the etrog, which is the citron. You have the hadas, which is the myrtle branch. And then you have the arava, which is the willow. I'm sorry, the lulav I call the willow, which is actually a palm frond, okay? So you have the palm, the willow, the myrtle, and the citron. Now, there were those who were selling myrtle branches, which were perfect quality. And it appears that because of the rarity of finding such a specimen, they were charging a fortune. Shmuel says to them, equate the price that you demand for myrtle branches to their value and sell your myrtle branches. Lower your prices, sell them for what they're actually worth. And if you do not do so and overcharge, I will teach a ruling, a halachic ruling in public for you, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, another rabbi who allows the use of myrtle branches whose tops are severed. I will be more lenient on the halachic ruling in order to use damaged myrtles in order that you, and I'll basically ruin you. I'll put you out of business. Because if I teach that you're allowed to use severed myrtle branches, then those come a dime a dozen. Everyone will be able to find those on the side of the road. You'll go out of business. So it's a fascinating example here. And there are more than one of these examples in the Talmud where rabbis came and threatened to change a halachic ruling to make it more lenient in order that people should not be overcharged. And I found this to be absolutely incredible, that in order to allow for people to afford things that they need, right? This is a Jewish mitzvah. This is something that everybody in the Jewish people had to do. They had to purchase, and to lock people out of, or to exploit people, and charge a fortune for what is something that at that time is a necessity. Shmuel felt was so dishonest and so unethical that he was willing to change a halachic ruling in order to prevent that from happening. So you actually start to see here that there is a bit of a not just good business practice that we're commenting on, but actually a question of ethics, that there's something that Shmuel found to be morally repulsive, so much so that he was willing to be lenient in matters of Jewish law. So I found that to be an incredibly telling source, which seems to now push us in the direction of saying that one should refrain from such practices. If you know that this is something that people need, and it's something that's, that you are unfairly raising the prices, and we have to discuss what's fair and what's unfair, but maybe let's say a sixth, you cannot do that. You can't do that. And if you do, let's put it this way: you can do it, but you shouldn't. Now, to end this all off and to kind of leave us with a question mark, I want to bring to you one more source, which I unfortunately was not able to find in time, but it's something that my wife told me only last night, which is that there's a well-known story in Tanakh, in the writings of the prophets, whereby there was a woman called the Isha Shunamit, the Shunamis woman, who was a very poor woman, but had done tremendous kindness for one of the prophets, Elisha. Okay, she had housed him. She had put him up to stay several times, and had done tremendous kindness with him. And at a certain point in her life, she is incredibly poor and has nothing to feed her child. And Elisha says, I want you to find all of the vessels in your house. Take out every vessel, a bowl, a cup, a potted plant potter, anything you can find. And I want you to start taking this flask of oil and start pouring. And I'm telling you now that as long as you still have vessels to fill up, this flask will miraculously continue to pour oil so that it fills up every single vessel in your house. So the Shunammite woman does this. She starts pouring and pouring and pouring, and miraculously the flask does not run out until she has filled up every single flask in her house. Every vessel, a potter, a cup, a glass, a bowl, you name it, everything. Okay? Now, here's the kicker. One of the famous commentaries on Nach, Rabbi David Kimchi, the Radak, says that in addition to this miracle, there was another miracle, which is that at that time, there happened to be a shortage of oil. And so the Shunammite woman was able to sell her oil at a substantially higher price than she normally would have. And that's what allowed her to make a fortune off of the oil. And so we find, fascinatingly, that there seems to be a case of price gouging that was condoned by one of the prophets. And not only that, but oil was seemingly an essential commodity at that time, which oil still is a pretty essential commodity. But back then, much more so, it was used for lighting candles, the only source of light at the time, as well as for cooking. So it was a much bigger deal. So I wanted to add that in, to add in a little bit of an ellipsis to our cases here, because as we know, Jewish law is complex and nuanced. And I think that what we've found today is that there's some middle ground. It's a very gray area. You're not allowed to overcharge people unknowingly. If they're a tourist and they have no idea what they're paying for, and you charge them an absolute fortune, that is hands down an inappropriate and illegal thing to do, and a morally reprehensible thing to do. However, if it is known that there is a scarcity in the market, or that temporary situations in the market have made it such that a particular commodity is now much more in demand. So certainly there is no explicit prohibition of doing such a thing. But at the same time, we see that there were rabbinic authorities who felt that they either have to regulate market prices or demand that sellers reduce their prices, and even in such cases as teaching lenient opinions in Jewish law in order to bring back down the price, in order so that people should not exploit other people. And I think that everyone kind of has to use their judgment. If you know that, like Daniel said, there are extenuating circumstances whereby you're either permitted to charge such a thing because who knows, maybe it took you maybe for you to get hand sanitizer was such a mission, was such an unbelievable difficult process. And now you want to charge because that's how difficult it was to obtain hand sanitizer, or in other cases whereby you think that adding a tax onto fuel or overcharging for cigarettes is actually a positive and ethical thing. So then I think that's one scenario which I would probably say that that's a permissible thing to do. If, however, you are somebody who is just exploiting the current situation, there's a need, there's a craze, there's a demand right now, you have stock, other people don't, and you're needlessly, let's say needlessly overcharging. So then that might be a case whereby you have to use your better judgment and be able to provide something for other people. Now, Austin, you had a couple comments here, which I'd invite you to share if you'd like to. You sent me a couple comments in the private chat. If you'd rather not share, that's fine. But you're not. By the way, by private comments, I don't mean you're snickering behind other people's backs. You're just sending me your comments about thoughts that you have on this case. There's something. Do you want to kind of share it?
I'm not sure if my microphone's working. Is it now?
Again, it's kind of going loud and soft. If you want, I can read out your comments if you'd like to.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Or
So,
if you think they're appropriate to
yeah. Okay. So Austin, you're saying that it seems that the case of the Tsunami woman was one where the market price was high, whereas in other price situations you can't charge more than the market price. So that's a good point. You're saying that in the case of Bava Basra, whereby there were swindlers who were clearly charging more than the market price. So then that might be a case whereby we have to appoint people. You're absolutely right, and I think that that may be one way of answering the distinction. When are you allowed to sell high? Maybe it's a case where there is a real shortage. Maybe in a case of a shortage, it's absolutely permissible. Although we seem to be saying that the people who were selling the Myrtle branch were, even though perfect myrtles were very hard to come by, Shmuel still felt as if people were overcharging and that they were not allowed to overcharge for that. Now, you sent me another comment which says, in the case of the myrtle and the eggs in the water, are all cases where someone is charging much more than the thing is actually worth. Whereas the Tsunami case is showing that in exigent circumstances, necessities are simply worth more. So I definitely think that is a healthy approach. In other words, that's definitely a possibility in terms of understanding the seeming contradictions here or difficulties within the sources that we've provided. Whereby you're saying, Austin, that the areas where we have to regulate the market are cases whereby there isn't a shortage and the market price is very set, and yet nonetheless you're still overcharging. I would say there might be an alternative case, Austin, which might be a case of cartels. Because if you remember, let's say you're selling eggs at double the price, which the Torah says you're not allowed to do based on that source. But if everybody else is selling eggs for way lower, then you're going to go out of business pretty quickly. You know, you're right. You may get a few suckers who are going to come to your store and unknowingly purchase, but that is a prohibition of onat mamon, the first prohibition that we looked at. I think there's another case whereby you could say, what if all the egg sellers, and this is actually probably the case that took place with the myrtle sellers, because Shmuel was addressing all of the myrtle sellers as a whole. They had probably formed a cartel. They had probably joined together, and like OPEC had jointly agreed to raise the prices of myrtles substantially more than they would have been worth had they allowed open competition. And in that case, I think Shmuel felt the need to call out and say, you know what, this is an unfair business practice. You're not allowed to do such a thing. So if that's the case, then perhaps we could say that what Shmuel was objecting to is cartels. The woman who wanted to sell oil was only doing so because she was allowed to. That wasn't a cartel. There was a real shortage, and she was really allowed to sell based on the shortage. And of course, the open and shut case of pure exploitation, where the person who was buying it doesn't know they're being overcharged, that's clearly prohibited. So I think that might be an accurate way of distinguishing amongst the sources that we've seen so far. If anybody has any final comments that they'd like to make, feel free, chime in.
Would you say that the most ethical form of selling them would be an auction?
Oh, that's interesting.
Doesn't that favor the most wealthy?
Sorry, Austin, we didn't catch that.
Doesn't that absolutely favor the most wealthy?
Doesn't that absolutely favor the what?
Most wealthy?
Doesn't that favor the most wealthy? Well, it depends. I mean, if you go onto eBay, so it favors the person who can buy it at that price. Now, if there's something like, if there's a commodity which is a very common good, let's say you're just selling flour. So there, you know, the auctioning will not favor the most wealthy, because if there's a huge supply, so then no supplier is ever going to be able to sell it for more than the market price. You know, it might be that in certain types of goods, an auction might be the best case. But I think that if we're talking about commodities, you know, I think an auction might be an inefficient way of selling it, because the best way would be simply to create healthy competition, to find the person who can sell their flour the cheapest, and other people are going to be forced to compete, and so that's going to make it the best price for the consumer. But without getting too much into economic theory, I think all of these are very interesting, you know, different variations on a similar theme. It appears, however, that the conclusion might be that there are certainly examples where it's permissible to overcharge, as long as the person who's buying it is aware that they're overcharging. There are certain cases where it is kind of looked down upon to create a fictitious overcharging, and a fictitiously high market value, such as forming a cartel where you agree to inflate the prices and force everybody to have to pay more. And then we have the open and shut case of overcharging somebody unbeknownst to them. So I think that's kind of the conclusion there. I want to thank everybody who was participating. Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to everybody who is watching on YouTube. Hope you enjoyed this installment of Law and Ethics Debates. Thank you, guys. We will, please God, be doing our third and probably final of this series next week, Monday at 1 p.m. UK time. Thanks, everyone, for being involved.
Thank you.
See you, Daniel.
Thank you.
See you all.